Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today my guest, it's a great pleasure, is Nimrod Ben Zeev. Nimrod obtained his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2020 and currently is a Polonsky Academy Fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and at the same time, he holds a postdoc position at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is the author of a number of articles dedicated to labor history, and particularly on cement, which we will discuss later on. But more importantly, he's in the process of publishing his much-awaited book, Foundations of Inequality. But first of all, Nimrod, welcome.
Thank you very much, Roberto. It's a pleasure to be here.
The first question I want to ask you is very much connected to your area of research. When we think about Jerusalem and Palestine, obviously there's a lot of work done on obviously the conflicts, on ethnic communities, religious institutions, and obviously the politics, diplomacy. And in the last decade or so, we also saw a number of works dedicated to specific area, gender history, for instance, or anthropological studies. But you're working on material. And I remember reading your article on Jerusalem Quarterly about cement, and I was just blown away. I just didn't figure out exactly how could you write history following cement. Then it made sense, obviously, because cement is the building foundational material in order to build a house, a factory, anything really. And so I was wondering, how did you get to work on building materials, and particularly on cement?
So this is I'm sure you can imagine it's a question that comes up in conversation. How did you find yourself? What on earth made you choose this subject? I think what happened to me is what happens to a lot of people who are working on their dissertations, starting their PhD studies. I came in with one idea of what I was going to do. Which was, a sort of a sensory history of different environments, orange groves and construction sites and stuff like that. And it was supposed to be a very sort of colorful and sensuous history, also sort of influenced by the sensory turn. And I started writing a paper about cement as part of sort of my studies and the history of construction through the lens of cement. And I realized that this was a whole vast sort of field in terms of the importance of materials like cement and stone and reinforced concrete, as well as the sort of role of construction work in the history of Israel-Palestine, that has been, it's never really true to say untouched, but has had very little written about it from a historical perspective, and it sort of seems, so someone needs to write this. It might as well be me. So that's sort of the story of how I found myself in the cement.
Thinking about the material itself, can you give us a sense of how cement developed in Palestine? Your work basically spans from, say, the end of the Ottoman era up to the 1940s. So I was wondering, to what extent cement was available, whether it was traded, between different countries around Palestine, or actually was a local produce.
That's a really good question, and it's sort of the answer is I would say, multi-layered, in the sense that from different perspectives, the entry of cement can be dated a little differently. The entry of cement into Palestine, the first shipments, I think, of what we think of as modern cement, and there were other, cement-like materials, other mortars that were used traditionally in Palestine, but the sort of Portland cement that we think of as modern cement enters Palestine in the final decades of the 19th century, and it enters first as an import through the port in Jaffa, primarily, to some extent, I think, also from the port in Gaza, although Jaffa, I think, is the primary entry, and it enters from various sources. Belgium is one exporter. British cement makes its way, and the people who were using it are the Templars, who are incorporating cement quite early on in their construction projects, and later on, it becomes incorporated into sort of early Zionist architecture around Tel Aviv, but also in the work of Palestinian contractors, first as a different kind of mortar, so not in sort of concrete construction, but using cement as a mortar itself. And the real forceful entry, there are attempts, and the architect Alexandrovich wrote about this. There are attempts around the start of Tel Aviv to really introduce cement forcefully as a way of differentiating between what is Jewish construction and what is Palestinian construction, what is Palestinian Arab construction. And those efforts start in the 1910s, 1909, 1910s, and they sort of fail in a fairly significant way. And the real entry is the 1920s. 1920s is when you really start seeing much more cement being imported. It's also when you have the first cement factory established, the Nesher factory, which is still the largest cement producer, has been for the past almost 100 years, on and off, a monopoly of cement production within the land, the region, and that's when it really starts to pick up. I think it's 1920s, certainly 1930s, 1940s. It's gradually becoming more significant than stone in Palestinian construction practices, as well as sort of Jewish Zionist construction practices.
You mentioned a number of very fascinating elements, and made me think about how, for instance, particularly in the late Ottoman and obviously with the British mandate, Jerusalem was built in stones, even though this was only the outer layer of the houses, because it was too expensive to use the stone, and the British eventually allowed corrugated iron to be put behind a thin layer of stones. But quite interestingly, I never really found records about cement, so I guess for practical reasons, they relied on cement. So I was wondering, to what extent actually the cement itself was relevant for building Palestine for both the Zionists and the Arabs, particularly in the during the Mandate era.
So I think Jerusalem, and obviously this, you've written about the stone and sort of stores and the Jerusalem society. Jerusalem is in many ways the exception to the rule, I think, in terms of the legislation essentially restricting construction to at least stone facades. And whereas other places in Palestine move more quickly towards concrete construction. I would say that the place of cement there are several ways to track this. So one way is to look at the sort of writing about cement in the Zionist thinking, for example, in even early Zionist thinkers. So when Theodor Herzl writes Alt Neuland, the sort of Old New Land, the sort of programmatic-ish novel for what the Jewish homeland will look like, there is one moment in the novel itself where among the sort of achievements of the Jewish society, the new Jewish society, new Jewish national society there, the establishment of a cement factory is cited as a major achievement. It's interesting that there's sort of several layers of technology here, because the way the reader is exposed to this narrative is through a record, a phonograph record that they're listening to in the novel, detailing the technical achievements. So it's sort of a double sort of layer of technicality and sort of technology in the novel itself. And Arthur Rupin talks about cement factories as an interest of the Zionist endeavor, as sort of a way of constructing more efficiently. So does, I'm blanking now, the name will come back to me. Not Katinka, Nahum Wilbuszewski also talks about a plan for a cement factory in the early sort of 1900s, 1910s. And at the same time, you also see sort of financial interests, American and otherwise, thinking about, Palestine is ready for either massive cement imports or even a cement factory. So in the Zionist sort of story, there's also an almost mythical level to the attention to the material. You have those classic songs, classic poems and songs by Nathan Alterman, who talks about dressing the land in a gown of concrete and cement, as sort of part of the achievements, part of what the Zionist mission in Palestine is. And there's a lot of investment, also a lot of capital going in that direction. So people like Michael Pollack, who ends up establishing Nesher as a sort of massive economic undertaking. And that story, I think, as part of the story of building the land, the sort of Zionist quest of to build and to be built, is fairly well known. The sort of mythic dimensions of the materials, even if we don't really think about them, they're part of the sort of myth of Hebrew labor, building the land, etc. But there's also, I think what's most interesting to me is that there's a Palestinian counterpart to this in the Mandate period. And I mentioned this in the article that you mentioned earlier, the Jerusalem Quarterly article, where Palestinians, especially Palestinians writing in the press, but also sort of what Shirin Saikali, the people who Shirin Saikali refers to as Palestine's men of capital, are thinking about cement and concrete in very similar terms, as sort of materials that are essential to the project of, even if not quite in the terms of building a nation state at this stage, say in the late 20s, mid 30s, certainly materials necessary for a form of economic independence, a form of releasing themselves from the reliance on the colonial British authorities, and of modernizing Palestinian society in sort of material terms. So it certainly has a place.
This made me wonder about the political value of cement, in a sense. I mean, when we think about today how, as part of the conflict, of the ongoing conflict, also there's the management of cement, whether cement can be sent to Gaza or not, for instance, to what extent Palestinians in East Jerusalem can access cement or not. And also the same as in the West Bank, so there's a sort of a limited amount of materials. And this really shows how this obviously has a long history behind, and it comes from an ideology connected to the material itself. Perhaps I'll ask you about what you think about it later, but right now
Sure.
I was thinking about, this idea that cement is also connected with the arrival of the Zionists, particularly on the Zionist side, and also the establishment of a town, which is still there up north, close to Haifa, and the city is Nesher. There are various plans throughout the region, some of them that can be seen driving, but certainly Nesher is like essentially was built upon the idea of becoming an, if I may say, like a sort of a cement town where that was the main production. And I was wondering, how did this play out? This was like a plan, as you said. This was just the result of, unplanned sort of, business operations. And also, to what extent Jews and Arabs, particularly during the Mandate, cooperated in the production of cement?
Okay, no, that's those are really, really good questions, and we can absolutely get back to the question of sort of the long durée of cement and concrete in Palestine, Israel. I'd love to talk about that. So Nesher, my sense is that Nesher, the town Nesher, which starts as sort of the residential quarters for the factory workers, is, I haven't seen the term company town used specifically, but everything about Nesher's sort of the Nesher, the city, the way it springs up, the way it's established, its very close ties to the factory seem like the story of a company town. Certainly for the factory's proprietors, for the management, for the capital sort of interests behind it, the thinking was, we need to have workers on site. We need to have them living close by. We will give them these sort of living quarters, basic sort of infrastructure and institutions, and it does essentially become a company town. I think in a planned way, and I also think, and there may be other people who can correct me about this, that it's fairly unique in this context when you look at patterns of Zionist settlement. I don't think you see this sort of company town structure as such. And part of it has to do, I think, with the fact that Nesher is a full-blown capitalist venture from the get-go. Michael Pollack, who establishes it, is maybe sympathetic to Zionism. You could even say is certainly sympathetic to Zionism, but he also walks a very tight line throughout his time in the management of the company between sort of being sympathetic to the Zionist movement, but trying to keep Nesher not directly affiliated with Zionism itself. He sees the project as one that, and with good reason, he sees the project and the enterprise as one that has markets throughout the Middle East, who aims at competing with cement factories in Damascus and in Lebanon and even further afield. And for that to happen, he has to distance himself from Zionism to a certain extent. Now, this changes during World War II when he essentially sells off his shares, and the Histadrut, the sort of General Federation of Trade Unions, firmly within the labor Zionist camp, buys half of the ownership of the company. Another group of, again, very strictly Zionist Sort of business elites also buy into the company, and now it's very clearly Zionist. In 1944, I think, is the year this happens. But beforehand, one of the ways that he tries to walk this line between sort of being affiliated with the Zionist movement and being a Middle Eastern, and I think in Pollack's own mind, a British, almost imperial company, thinking about, Haifa as an imperial city, as Jacob Norris has taught us to think, and Pollack is very much of this mindset. One of the things that he does and is able to maintain for quite some time is that he insists on Palestinian Arabs and Jews working for Nesha. He's able to maintain and this should come with scare quotes, mixed factory up until the Great Arab Revolt, the rebellion of 1936. That's not to say that work was divided equally, though. And this goes to the other question. Up until 1938, I want to say, which is when the work becomes fully Jewish, Arabs work in the quarry, in Nesher's quarry. For the most part, and Nesher starts operations in 1925. So for 11 years, from 1925 to 1936, they work under a Palestinian contractor and are not employees of the factory, but employed by this contractor. They're doing very difficult and quite different work to the Jews who are working only in the factory, primarily in skilled jobs. And so that's one way to keep it supposedly a neutral company. But even there, you see how it's very much hierarchical.
I was looking at some of your works in the past few days, and I was also fascinated by the fact that you looked also at the question of race and colonialism that you already mentioned, alongside just the question of material. And so I was wondering, what exactly is the connection here? I mean, how race and materials can come together.
That's a tough one, in the sense that it's one of the questions that that animates my work, I think. I think that if we are to if we understand race as a category, obviously we are well beyond the point of understanding that race is both culturally and socially constructed, has no physical holding or bearing as a category of actually addressing human beings, but works as a social category primarily. Even if we are to accept that, race has a lot to say, and is primarily oriented to material bodies, right? That's the object of sort of racial thinking, of these sort of hierarchies of race, are almost always very closely attached to the physicality of the racialized subject. And I think that I found that looking at materials, and particularly looking at how people engage with, or people talk about how other groups engage with materials, with physical labor, etc., is where a lot of racial thinking comes to the surface. Because you're talking about physical bodies, about physical propensities. And so to give an example, it's hard to deny how important race was as a category for the British Empire in the particularly in the period, well, long before, but also particularly in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, when you conceive of not only the British, but many people around the world conceive of the world as the world itself, geopolitics, as divided along racial lines, white peoples, non-white peoples, the category of sort of white dominions that emerges within the British Empire. And for the British, as well as for other sort of colonizing empires, race is also a very important category for the division of labor. Who is able to do what work, who is unable to do certain kinds of labor. And the British introduced this notion, well, to say introduce is maybe not entirely accurate. The British bring in their own interpretation of this notion of a racial division of labor, also to these questions of materials. So Jews, for the British, are a highly technical people, and are better suited, and this is almost verbatim, sort of the things that the British write about when they talk about, for example, building the Haifa harbor, are better suited for more technical jobs like working with reinforced concrete and concrete blocks. Whereas again, in the British mindset, Arabs are stronger physically, are more tolerant of sort of different kinds of strain and pain and hard work, and are therefore better suited for hard labor, longer hours. And again, to us, this sounds blatantly racist and completely ridiculous, as sort of a notion of different bodily propensities. But for the British, this was very material and very real as a tool for dividing labor. And I think that what happens is that both Zionists and Palestinians have their own sort of racial baggage in terms of racial thinking that they move into the 20th century with. There's been more and more writing about it in the Middle Eastern context in the past 2 decades or so, certainly in the past few years, sort of tracing how ideas about race find their way into Middle Eastern intellectual history, and showing that their origins are not solely imported, but also based on sort of Islamic Muslim encounters, Arab encounters with Africa, with the Caucasus, etc. And there's also a slightly older strain of sort of studying Zionist thought and Jewish thought in Central Europe, but also Eastern Europe and their engagements with race. And these all meet in sort of British Mandate period Palestine. Osama Makdisi has taught us about the Ottoman Orientalisms and the place of race in the Ottoman discourse, which also has a role here. But certainly when we think about the Mandate, it's a very charged moment in terms of racial politics. And I think that the materials and labor in general really bring that to the surface.
And this is a good reminder that studying critical race theory is important, regardless of the political views, but it is essential in order to understand the role of racism, but more importantly of the question of race itself, which obviously in the conflict in Israel and Palestine is central to, even though often is neglected, but it's part of the conflict and the narratives too. Which brings me to ask you about your other work, essentially when you talked about Palestinian workers, but now this is like post-1948, so these are Palestinian citizens of Israel, and obviously they found themselves in these new situations. They had to essentially adapt and come to some form of a deal with the state and with also the new belonging. And here you are writing about how essentially your argument is that how they become crucial in building modern Israel. So you have this kind of interesting identity of being essentially conquered, but at the same time, they become crucial in the construction industry. In the article, you talk about the period 1940-1973, and I was wondering why that period. And also, when you look at West Jerusalem, which obviously between 48 and 67 was divided, I was also wondering to what extent Palestinian citizens of Israel contributed to what I call the cementification of Jerusalem, given the massive amount of buildings that have been built after 48, particularly in West Jerusalem.
So I'll start from the last part of the question. I don't know the answer to the role of Palestinian labor, Palestinian workers during this period, during 48 to 67, say, in the cementification of Jerusalem. I like that. I think that it would be relatively safe to assume that it may have been less substantial than in the construction of, say, Tel Aviv, certainly Haifa, during this period. In part because when you look at, the sort of geography and demography of Palestinian citizens within Israel after the Nakba, after 48, Jerusalem is actually quite cut off from the sort of major concentrations of Palestinian population in the decades immediately after 48. It's sort of further out because the eradication of Palestinian settlements on the road to Jerusalem was almost complete during the war, and because the other surrounding areas are in the West Bank under Jordanian rule now. So it would be slightly more remote. There's also, I think, a story in Jerusalem of a substantial Mizrahi population, working class Mizrahi population after 48, also prior to 48, but certainly in the early 50s and 60s, who if I understand the demography of the construction industry correctly, become the bulk of the workforce in construction in Jerusalem itself during this period. So, for example, I spoke with Reuven Abergil, one of the founders of the Black Panthers here in Jerusalem, of the social sort of resistance movement of the Black Panthers and later the Black Panther Party. And one of the things that Abergil tells in sort of recounting his experiences is becoming a construction worker at a very young age, working on construction sites. And the sort of surroundings, the social surroundings on the construction site that he describes are by and large Mizrahi. So you have some Ashkenazi foremen and maybe some Ashkenazi workers, but not as many Palestinian workers in Jerusalem itself.
So, sorry to interrupt, but I was wondering
Sure.
if this is still part of the sort of racial profiling of Mizrahi Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, because now Palestinians in Israel may be trusted or not, but they were the builders essentially before, so
Mm-hmm.
now they replaced with Mizrahi. There are fellow Arabs in that sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I would say that part of the story, as I see it, and the story that I'm telling, is precisely a story of the racialization of certain fields, certain forms of labor, certain industries. For me, the main story that I focus on is that of construction, and that racialization begins during the Mandate period, even as you have this sort of labor Zionist vision of creating the new Jew through physical labor and the vision or the ideal of the Hebrew construction worker. By the early 40s, you see how in Jerusalem in particular, construction work is often largely Mizrahi, also already before 1948. So on the sort of more rooted Mizrahi communities within Jerusalem that existed before 48, as well as new groups of immigrants. And elsewhere, Palestinians are taking on more and more of even the skilled work, again, before 48. After 48, what you have is a process of very rapid racialization of the industry, certainly of unskilled labor, but also increasingly of other portions of the industry. And what this racialization means is that first, it becomes largely Mizrahi. By the late 1950s, I think about 40% of the workforce in construction are Mizrahi Jews, which is a lot proportionately. And by the early 1960s, so several years later, you see that Palestinians are slowly sort of becoming more and more prominent, not prominent, but predominant, because they are largely sort of siloed into unskilled labor or sort of lower skilled professions. But yes, I see this racialization as happening both with Mizrahi Jews and with Palestinians. And later on, if we continue further forward in the mid-1990s, early 2000s, it becomes an industry that largely incorporates what we call foreign workers, what other countries would probably call guest workers. So Southeast and South Asians, Eastern Europeans, Turkish workers, etc. So the industry itself is very closely linked, or becomes very closely linked, to these forms of racialized and marginalized labor.
Reflecting again about the title of your article, which essentially connects also ideally with the title of what will be your book, Foundation of Inequality. You talk about this idea of we built this country. So I was wondering, which country did these Palestinians build? I mean, I think it's an interesting point. You talked about the fact that they've been active in the business, but do we know what these workers were thinking about? I mean, what were their reactions? The fact that they were employed in building a state that essentially took over their belonging, their feelings, but also their property. So I was wondering if there's any chance to get a feeling of what was the relationship between these workers and not just the company that employed them, but also the state and the ideology of building.
So that's a complex question. I think a different and again, if we focus on sort of the construction workers who come from within the strata of Palestinians able to remain after the Nakba, so Palestinian citizens within Israel, I think that one thing is that for many this was, and I think it's no secret that for many this was a means of survival. Construction work paid well. It still does, relatively, even if it's often very unstable employment in terms of you have no guarantee of when exactly you will have work, when not, etc. It still pays well. It was hungry for workers, and you have this group of largely rural Palestinian men by this stage, because the construction industry becomes very, very masculine throughout this period. They find in it a way to provide for families who have been cut off from, first of all, cut off from the whole region, right? They've been cut off from after 48, Bilad Sham, so greater Syria. They are also cut off because of the military administration, even from neighboring towns frequently, because there's no freedom of movement, or at least not full freedom of movement. They're often cut off from their own lands because of the expropriations that take place in the early years of the state and afterwards. And they have to very quickly adapt to this new reality. And going to look for work, often at first independently, often in secret, because you don't have a work permit or a sort of freedom of movement permit from the military administration, is something that people find themselves doing out of necessity. There are people among my interviewees, there are Palestinians who I've spoken to who really try to mobilize their role in the sort of very material process of constructing the state. The quote of "we built this country" is from one Palestinian labor organizer, essentially, Muhammad Abu Ahmad from Nazareth, who became a fairly high-ranking functionary in the same Histadrut that we talked about a little earlier, the same General Federation of Trade Unions, when it does open its door to Palestinian membership, to Arab membership. And so for someone like Muhammad Abu Ahmad, I think this ability to claim a stake in the country has a lot to do with sort of the way he aligned himself within the larger political framework. Certainly, he sees himself as Arab. I believe that he would also call himself Palestinian. Certainly, his children, I think, are more fully devoted to their Palestinian identity than he may have found himself comfortably being in terms of carving out a space for himself. But it's a way of laying a claim and saying, we played an instrumental role in creating this thing that you call the State of Israel, and we deserve, everything that comes with that in terms of our rights as citizens, in terms of our economic rights, our place in this society. And I should contextualize this. This came up in the conversation with Muhammad Abu Ahmad, because he mentioned the condescension that he encountered from Israeli Jews who would sort of, carry this mantle of we served in the military and we did this and that, and the ways in which Palestinian citizens' rights are infringed upon through these various arguments. They don't do military service, they don't do national service, et cetera, et cetera. So for someone like Muhammad Abu Ahmad, he says, well, yeah, okay, we built this place. So this place would not have existed without our labor, and don't start, these sort of games of accounting for who did what, because we have as much of a stake, certainly as much of a contribution as you do. Other people, I would say, approach this very differently. Other interviewees who didn't align themselves with sort of labor Zionism in such a manner, either sort of viewed this as non-political or apolitical, and also position themselves as such. They're working because it's work, and they're not thinking about the sort of political consequences, although obviously in their experiences, they encounter them all the time. The fear from them, the way they feel their lives are being regarded as less valuable, etc. And another group of interviewees sort of sees their role in construction as part of a more revolutionary attitude. So they may say, yes, the reality is that we built this country in a similar manner, but also the vision we have as part of building this is very different. We view this as you know, the foundation for a equal society. And the way that we've used our position in construction, our knowledge in the construction industry, has been to promote this vision of an equal society. So those are sort of several of the visions that we see.
I want to fast forward to the longue durée, which we mentioned earlier. When we think about cement today, particularly in the last 2 decades or so, let's say since Oslo, cement is about settlers building settlements, is about Palestinians in East Jerusalem trying to build up essentially apartment on top of apartment in order to keep the resident permit, the famous blue ID card, but also is the prevention of cement to go into Gaza in order to avoid essentially Hamas to rebuild what has been destroyed. And so I was wondering, you mentioned earlier, well, let's talk about the longue durée. And now I was like, yes, I think we should talk about the longue durée, because there are very contradicting views about the material, but also it really shows the complexity and the various layers when we just look at one single, material, which is foundational, as you would say, the title of your work.
Yeah, the puns are endless in terms of, you know, something that is concrete, something that is foundational, cementing. So it's very hard to avoid. But I think that it is actually really helpful to think about this in sort of a longer history of the various materials that I deal with, so cement and concrete and stone, and also the sort of longer history of who does the actual work of construction. And I think that one of the things that the various points that you raise about the contemporary moment, the need to use, to sort of build almost ad hoc and sort of in a very rudimentary fashion, often in Palestinian East Jerusalem, has antecedents in sort of the construction methods of Palestinian towns and villages within Israel. So the same citizens who I was talking about earlier, when they build their homes in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they often are facing similar, not identical, because their citizenship maybe is first of all, they're citizens, not just residents, and it's more secure than that of East Jerusalem, East Jerusalemites, but nonetheless, they are not given the opportunity to build. And you have this architecture that arises from that, which is this bare concrete, very often incomplete or sort of in stages architecture that you still see often in Palestinian towns within Israel, and certainly in East Jerusalem, which almost becomes sort of the marker of these localities, right? That's how you know where you are. If you're in Jerusalem itself and you're walking along the rail walkway, And you very quickly can see that you've made your way into Bet Safafa, in part because you start seeing houses that are maybe not entirely finished or have some bare concrete elements. And those are precisely the result of those restrictions that you mentioned, the need to build without permits, because permits are not being granted. The other places where we see concrete and cement, obviously being poured by the ton or by the dozens and hundreds of tons in the settlements, again, for the most part by Palestinian workers, this time from the West Bank. So these structures of exploitation, of also finding yourself in a position that you are partaking, whether you like it or not, and you don't for the most part, in sort of the processes that are robbing you of your own land, because you need to survive, and the sort of economic structure that is built continue in the separation wall as this massive concrete sort of structure, and in Gaza, whereas you mentioned restrictions on cement, on the introduction of cement, are among the most trenchant in terms of the materials restricted in what is known as dual use materials. So materials that can be used for civilian purposes and supposedly can also be used for military purposes. But all of these categories and these materials have longer histories. Even the idea of a dual use material. So when the Zionist movement and sort of groups of labor Zionists, the labor brigade, Geduda Avoda, make their first inroads into quarries into the 1920s and 1930s, one of the things they do in the quarry, because there are explosions frequently, is manufacture explosives as part of sort of arming the sort of militias and practice in munitions and arms and weapon practice, because you can do that under the cover of the explosives of the quarry. Cement and concrete and stone are heavily, heavily politicized in this context. And you can see how they are sort of used differently by different actors, are given different valences by different actors. For those individuals, those families building in East Jerusalem now, or in Arabe or Kafalkana in the 1950s and 1960s, cement and concrete are the materials that you can work with the quickest. So there is a house to demolish, and it makes it more difficult for the authorities to destroy because there's something there already. And at the same time, it's also the materials that you can control, that you can use to restrict movement, that you can use to change the landscape. So I think this longer view is very helpful in that respect.
I have one last question. We follow one path, but I was wondering if there's anything that I didn't ask that you want to talk about.
I think that we've touched upon a lot of the things that are sort of germane to my research. One of the things that I mentioned this a couple of times. There is a weight to sort of the history of construction in stone and stone quarries that I see as going alongside that of cement and concrete in many ways, and can tell us a very sort of different story about who has control over a certain material, who is able to make better use of it, and sort of the politics of different materials are in fact different. one thing I think, I'd like for listeners to think about is also the bigger sort of underlying phenomenon. We can talk about, and we should talk about, the sort of the colonial backdrop for this, the backdrop of empire, of capitalism, of race and racial thought and racial politics and racism. And I think that the question of the devaluation of labor is also really important. How certain forms of labor are devalued, even if not monetarily, because as I said, construction work is actually fairly good pay, then certainly in terms of social status, in terms of security of employment, and in terms of safety and the risk to the body itself. One of the things that we see in recent years is increased attention to the outrageous amount of construction accidents in Israel-Palestine, but also within Israel in the Green Line, where we have some more data as opposed to what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza. And those are directly sort of those outrageous statistics, in my view, which make this not only the most dangerous industry in the land, but also a comparatively very dangerous construction industry as compared to other countries, including countries with very bad labor protections, is directly linked to these histories of racialization, of politicization. And I think we need to think about how this history takes a toll on workers, on their families, today, how it has done that historically. That to me is sort of one crucial aspect, and to recognize the prices that have been paid by workers, by their families, by their communities, and sort of take a pause for a moment and think about those prices, those sacrifices.
This was Nimrod Ben Zeev, currently a Polonsky Academy Fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute and a postdoctoral researcher at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and author of the upcoming book, hopefully soon, Foundations of Inequality. Nimrod, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roberto. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.